What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and with the NFL Draft kicking off on Thursday, I wanted to spend the next few days just kind of finalizing my pre-draft rookie rankings. Obviously, once the NFL Draft is over, I'll be updating all of those, but for today's specific video, I'm going to be going through my top 12 rookie wide receivers. We'll be talking about running backs tomorrow, and then probably do like a top 30 overall rookie rankings the day after that. But let's just dive right into the wide receiver ranks. Let me know your thoughts down below. Which players do you have higher, lower? I'd love to hear it. But we're going to start off in tier 1. I have 2 wide receivers in this tier. Haven't switched up. It's Marvin Harrison Jr. and it's Malik Neighbors. I think these guys are both top tier, very elite wide receiver prospects. And I really do think landing spots just going to determine who I have at number 1 and who I have at number 2. It's that close between these two guys. Right now, I do think Marvin Harrison Jr. has the better odds to have a nice landing spot, which would probably be either the Chargers or the Cardinals. He's currently minus 2,000 to go in the top 5. So even if you have a team like the Vikings trading into the number 4 pick, he's still going to be there, potentially available for the Chargers at number 5 if they do pick him over Neighbors. Whereas if you don't have the Cardinals and Chargers both going wide receiver, maybe Neighbors falls to 6 or later, which could end up being a less favorable landing spot. But like I said, we'll see how the draft plays out. They're going to be 1 and 2 for me, really, regardless of landing spot. It's just going to be the order that could potentially change. Now, looking at tier 2, same thing here. Rome Odunze has been locked into this spot. He's my clear wide receiver 3. Probably not going to move him up, or pretty much confirmed not going to move him up, and not going to move him down regardless of landing spot. He's the favorite to be picked within the first 9 selections, so he'll be getting that top 10 draft capital most likely. Very strong prospect. He didn't break out as a sophomore like Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors, but he had a very impressive junior and senior season. Obviously, the NFL views him very highly with where he's likely going to be picked. So I think Rome Odunze is a very strong prospect here, and in a weaker class, he probably could be the wide receiver 1. This is just a really strong class, especially with the top 2 in tier 1. Now shifting into tier 3, it's going to be another one-man tier. It's Brian Thomas Jr. I do think he's firmly behind Rome Odunze, but I also think he's firmly ahead of the wide receivers I have in tier 4. Just like Rome Odunze, he broke out in year 3. Didn't do a ton in year 1 or year 2, but he's a great athlete. 6'3", 210, run a 4.33 40. He's likely going to be the 4th wide receiver off the board. It seems, pretty locked in that the first 3 are going top 10. Brian Thomas probably going late teens, early 20s in terms of his draft capital. So we'll see what the landing spot is, but I do think, he's in a good spot here as my wide receiver 4. Now shifting into tier 4, this is where we get into a much larger tier, and I think in general there's just not a lot of consensus with how people are viewing these wide receivers. For me, I'm going to go with Xavier Worthy as my wide receiver 5. He's minus 225 to go in round 1, so a good shot he ends up getting picked on day 1. According to DraftKings, his 2 most likely landing spots are the Bills and the Chiefs. Either of those would obviously be great for his long-term upside, either pair him with Josh Allen or pair him with Patrick Mahomes. So that's definitely like the upside play you'd be rooting for there. And looking at this entire wide receiver class, he probably had the best freshman season out of all of them. Obviously, we want to see these players breaking out early. As a freshman, he caught 62 passes for almost 1,000 receiving yards, 12 touchdowns, had a 2.61 yards per route run, 8.5 yards after the catch per reception. So a great freshman season. He didn't really build on it, which is kind of the concern here, right? He didn't stack, improved years as a sophomore and a junior, but he still had 3 really strong seasons at the college level. He's only 5'11", 165 pounds, but a really strong athlete. Obviously, we know he has that crazy speed, 4.2, 140, so I do have him here as my wide receiver 5. Then behind him, I have Troy Franklin, and I'm probably going to be higher on Troy Franklin in consensus. He's likely going to be a day 2 pick. Odds aren't great for him going in round 1, but I think a round 2 pick would be just fine for him. His production profile is just so strong that it's tough for me to rank him much lower than this. As a sophomore, he caught 61 passes for 891 yards, 9 touchdowns, 2.34 yards per route run. Then he built on that in his junior year, 81 receptions for 1,383 receiving yards, 14 touchdowns, and a very, very impressive 3.32 yards per route run. So I know the combine wasn't great. He didn't look great in some of the drills, but when he was on the field, he was producing. Solid size, kind of light, not insanely fast for his size, but I think he'll be just fine, and hopefully he gets a nice landing spot in round 2. Then after Franklin, I'm going to be going with A.D. Mitchell as my wide receiver 7. He's a great athlete, 6'2", 205, ran a very fast 4.3, 4.40, also jumped very well, so a really strong overall athlete, and also has that impressive size. He didn't do a ton in his first 2 years at Georgia. He did a little something as a freshman, but nothing crazy. But in his junior year, after transferring to Texas, he caught 55 passes for 845 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns. At this point, he seems pretty much like a lock to go in round 1. He's minus 700. I just can't quite rank him ahead of Xavier Worthy. I know some people do have Mitchell over Worthy. I just think with Worthy having such great production in year 1 and year 2, and then with them actually playing together, Worthy was still more productive. So it's tough for me to put him over Xavier Worthy, but I still think they're in the same tier. Both are likely going to go round 1. We'll see what the landing spots look like for these two. And that definitely could be the swing, right? If Mitchell ends up going to the Bills or the Chiefs, and Worthy has a much less favorable landing spot, that could end up flipping them. So they're in the same tier, definitely some room for movement. Then after Mitchell, we're going to be going with Ladd McConkey, and he's a slight underdog to get picked in round 1. So he's plus 135 to get picked in the first, but definitely live to go in the end of that round. His counting stats in college weren't great, but his yards per route run were pretty impressive. 2.71 as a freshman, 2.16 as a sophomore, 3.26 as a senior, which is very impressive. He's 6 foot, 186, ran a pretty fast 4.39 40. I think his landing spot will be really interesting. Just looking at the counting stats, you wouldn't think he'd be getting this kind of hype, but it seems like film guys really love him. It seems like the NFL is very in on him, so we'll see where he ends up landing. And then the final player in tier 4, I could see an argument for him getting pushed to tier 5, and maybe that happens when we see the draft capital or the landing spot, but I'm going to have Keon Coleman. Very likely going to be a day 2 pick. A few months ago, it seemed like everyone loved him. It seemed like he was expected to be a round 1 pick. Things have definitely cooled off. A lot of that love has kind of faded away. He didn't have a great junior year, 50 receptions, under 700 receiving yards. Did catch 11 touchdowns, which is impressive, but a big concern is the way he wins. 34% of his targets were as contested targets, which is not great. You want guys to show that they can separate in college, and it's even less great when he really wasn't converting those. He only caught 33% of those contested targets. Now, that isn't necessarily super sticky year to year. Like as a sophomore, he was much better in contested catch situations. People didn't love the 40 time, 4.61, but outside of the 40, for his 6'3", 213 frame, he did test pretty well, and he also ran the routes very well and like at a very high speed. So I think he's faster when he's actually playing and running routes compared to just, running in a straight line for like a 40 dash. He's also very young, hasn't turned 21 years old yet. So I do think there are ways for Keon Coleman to pan out, but he is going to be the final wide receiver for me in tier 4. And then tier 5, we're going to have the number 10, number 11, and number 12. And there's probably a bunch of other wide receivers you could kind of lump into this tier. But we're going to start off with Xavier Legette. The massive red flag here was that he pretty much did nothing in his first 4 college seasons. That is very concerning, but in his 5th year when he finally produced, he had a big season. 71 receptions, over 1,200 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, 3.15 yards per route run. He had 6.4 yards after catch per reception. He's a very strong athlete, 6'1", 221, ran a 4.39, and it seems like he's pretty likely to get picked in round 2. I think round 3 at the latest is what we'd be looking at here in terms of draft capital. So I think he's kind of in this very congested tier of tier 5. And then after Legette, this is where I have Jalen Polk. In terms of his college career, he had a pretty productive junior season, nothing crazy, but by far his best year was his senior year, 69 receptions, 1,159 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. He's a dude who had a lot of target competition in his offense with Michael Penix at quarterback. You had Rome Odunze, also Jalen McMillan, who could get drafted somewhere in the same range as Jalen Polk. I guess the difference between Polk and McMillan here is they kind of swapped their production in their junior and senior seasons, where McMillan had the much better year as a junior, had the worst year as a senior. Polk wasn't as great as a junior, but way outproduced McMillan as a senior. I'd rather take the guy who's coming off the bigger year and they're actually playing together in the same offense. So this is an interesting situation just based on the fact you have three wide receivers who are going to get drafted here playing in the same offense. I think he's going to be a day 2 pick, so that's why I have him here in tier 5. And then my final wide receiver is going to be Roman Wilson. Kind of like Lad McConkey, his counting stats aren't great, and I definitely don't think he's, comparable as a prospect to Lad McConkey, but just in the fact that he's getting some hype, even though the counting stats aren't super impressive. But his yards per route run numbers were solid over his 4 seasons. Nothing like extreme, like no ceiling numbers, but they were fine. Ran a 4.39 40, so he's got some speed. Probably going to be a day 2 pick. Something that was interesting about his college profile was that he kind of moved all over the place. Sophomore year, he was primarily playing out wide. Then in his junior year, he pretty much moved entirely to the slot. So he went from pretty much always out wide to pretty much always in the slot. I think it was over 90% his junior year. And then his senior year was a little bit more balanced. Still, more focused in the slot, a little under 69%, but, a little bit more of a mix than we saw in his second and third college seasons. We'll see what the landing spot looks like. Like I said, probably going day 2, either round 2, round 3. There were definitely some other dudes you could throw in here, so if you prefer some of those options, I totally get it. I think draft capital, landing spot's probably going to determine that, for my post-draft rankings. But this is what we're looking at right now for my top 12 wide receivers. Like I said, I'll have running backs out tomorrow and then some overall rankings, probably super flex the day after that. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.